You're watching the WNUF Halloween Special.
The station. Reporter Frank Stewart has a special Halloween treat in store for viewers today.
First ever live on TV seance.
Weird. It's usually not good to start a YouTube video with an apology, and it's especially not good to start it with a plethora of apologies. So just know that I understand the etiquette behind all this, but I'm going to do it nonetheless because it's important to demonstrate my point here. First of all, this video is going to be a complete mess. I had a couple of ideas that I wanted to talk about, but didn't really have the time or understanding to fit it into a bunch of different videos. So the ideas covered are going to be a little all over the place. Also, at this particular moment, I'm working on about 6 or so long projects. 2 of them are about a year into production at this point, and they're still not done. So there's a lot of things sitting on the back burner that I want to take care of. And unfortunately, because of circumstances, I'm not going to be able to finish any of those until at least August. So you probably won't see another video out until at least August. Also, the mic, I know. I'm not doing this to look like a douchey video essayist YouTuber. My stand is currently not in this country, so apologies to Tom Nicholas about the appearance of unprofessionalism here. I don't think I have anything else to start out with a prerequisite. I just want to get that out of the way so people understand what this video is before they sit and watch me rant for the next 25 minutes. I hope you enjoy. So, horror is a genre that is constantly changing. There really is no set understanding of what horror is, how it works, how it should work, or really anything to that effect. That has long been the lineage of horror. It has been something that is, unlike almost every genre, wholly reflective of the time it's produced in. Which is true of every genre. It of course reflects the time it's produced in, but horror more than any other is squarely about that time, and that's why it often finds itself falling into social commentary or other ways of describing the problems of the times. This means that when there is a change in the current of horror, it's actually important to pay attention to because it signals in some ways a change in the current of society. Now, I've actually written a blog post about this before, and actually about a lot of the ideas I'm going to discuss today, so I'll leave a link down in the description if anyone's interested to go read the original review I had for Late Night with the Devil that spawned into this blog post. But essentially the idea I want to get at is that modern horror, that is contemporary horror, is largely based around this idea of nostalgia, and that usually materializes in the analog horror format, which has become increasingly popular, especially on platforms like YouTube, but of course has also seen its debut in movies, for instance Late Night with the Devil, or even mockumentary type stuff, you could look at even Blair Witch and say like Lake Mungo, for examples. But I think if you really want to look at the foundation of analog horror in films, you look at the WNUF Halloween Special. Now, this is something I didn't actually mention in that blog post I wrote, but the WNUF Halloween Special came out in 2013, which is, at this point, over 10 years ago. And it was really doing analog horror before even the internet had caught on to it. So it is, in that way, a big pioneer. The special is pretty simple. It's exactly what the title says it is. A fake television station, WNUF, goes to do a Halloween show where they go to a supposed haunted house and film the happenings within. Almost like Paranormal Activity in a way, but done much more interestingly. The point I'm trying to get at is that, historically speaking, in terms of the development of horror and where we are in the modern day, the WNUF Halloween Special is pretty important to that change. And so when I, the other day, went to go look for it, I was very shocked to find you can't find this anywhere. See, one of the things about WNUF is it was very dedicated to its cause. When it originally released, it was only distributed on VHS tape to fit with the aesthetic and, of course, the themes of the film and everything. Now, if you're observant, you might realize a problem with that VHS is a dead media format. Most people don't have it, and if you're buying it, you're more or less buying it out of novelty and not so much as a means of preservation. They did end up releasing a Blu-ray somewhat recently, to my knowledge. One of those distributors, Vinegar Syndrome or Scream Factory, or one of those obscure video producer distributors. But as far as I'm aware and was able to find, even that Blu-ray is now out of print. So this brings me to my first point of my rant and what has really launched me into this strange state of mind, forcing me to make this video, which is the lack of physical media and kind of control of distribution by corporations. Now, a lot of people are not going to be on board with this idea of lack of physical media or why it even should matter. But here's my point, right? WNUF is an incredibly historically important document that should be in some way preserved. And the fact is, you cannot find it anywhere online. And I don't just mean on streaming services. For instance, the rights were, as far as I'm aware, sent out to Shudder for a while, the streaming service with the worst UI ever. But it's no longer on there. I don't know if they lost the rights or what exactly happened. But it's no longer on any official streaming service. It's no longer uploaded to third-party platforms like Dailymotion, Vimeo, YouTube. And it's no longer even on piracy sites. It's really non-existent. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. I spent a long time looking for this Halloween special, and if anyone found it, please send me a link down in the comments so we can get this first part of the rant out of the way. The point being, this is an important document historically. Now, I know it would be absurd to compare it to, say, other full historical documents. For our Americans out there, maybe the Declaration of Independence or something. But we could compare it to other film documents. See, what happened a lot in old film is because it was produced on celluloid, a rather volatile material that had a habit of exploding and catching fire, a lot of old film was not well preserved and either decayed, caught on fire, or was somehow lost or destroyed by its production company or distributors. This famously happened to Magnificent Ambersons, something I'm going to talk about in one of those video projects I'm working on, where almost, I believe it was 2 or so hours of the film shot by Orson Welles originally was ordered destroyed by the studio and will never be recovered, ever. There's no chance that anyone will ever see the original entailed cut of the Magnificent Ambersons. And this is what I'm getting at with WNUF. See, when we lack a means of preservation, especially in this digital space where everything is so fleeting or is licensed and liable to disappear at any moment, we lose a great deal of history. Jacob Geller did a really interesting video on this about the fear of throwing things away, and this lady who did do a lot of VHS preservation through mostly random commercials and things like that. But my point is more at the production companies and distributors themselves. When we let big companies own the rights to art, it's very likely that the second that art becomes too niche to be profitable, that it will simply be removed. And if there's no remaining copies of that art, no physical presence to them, that removal will simply see it cease to exist from the world. This is no longer a case of, oh, a DVD's out of print, so now I have to pay $2,000 on eBay to get a copy of it. It's very possible that, say, a low-budget film that was only available on streaming and whose rights is owned by, let's just throw a name out there, A24, could suddenly pull that and you would have no access to it. This is kind of, interestingly, what happened a while for Under the Silver Lake, and why that film was a big flop is because after negative reaction to it, it almost ceased to exist for a while before A24 re-released it on various streaming platforms. And there may be a physical copy available now, I'm not really sure. See, what has happened a lot in the film industry and the art industry in general is that there's been an emergent reliance on trends. In our postmodern world, in the world that we exist in now, trends are perhaps the most important thing. Because we live in this world driven by corporations and driven by profit, following what is profitable, i.e. a trend, is incredibly important, not only to the companies trying to seek out this profit, but also to consumers. Because if you're aware of a trend, you can either fall into it or avoid it. Probably the most prevalent example in the past couple of years is the superhero movie genre, which has exploded since, I don't know, around 2008 with Dark Knight or Iron Man, maybe even a little earlier with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies, and is finally, after 15 plus years, starting to die out. That is an example of a trend where one small idea of profitability turned into an entire 2 decades worth of popular film production that occupied the entirety of the megaplex. Now, those pretty smart among you are going to see a big shift then that happens because of this. And this is not necessarily a new shift. It's a shift that's been happening since the 1800s and really took course post-World War II. But that is a trend that completely defines our modern generation and our own modern generation with art as well, the interactions we have, which is this transformation of art into content, as I like to call it. That is from something that genuinely expresses artist intention, that genuinely has something to say or needed to be made because it is a piece of what amounts to the human soul, versus something that has been corporately designed to sell money or to follow trends. That is a piece of content. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be a corporate product to be content. We see a lot of content on platforms like YouTube or TikTok as well, which is these pieces designed to, like I said, follow a trend or more likely to maximize profit. They, in essence, have an ulterior motive aside from self-expression and creation that is so paramount to what makes art art. Now, a lot of this goes back to the economic system of the world, or specifically to the United States as the leader of the so-called free world. A lot of our economic policy and, by connection, aesthetic policy determines what the rest of the world does. Now, the way we've set up our policy, that is our capitalist system, we have inspired a handful of things. First of all, is these trends. Trends emerge largely because there is a sequence of profitability. When one film is successful, say, for instance, Iron Man, there is then an incentive to make more films of the kind. because it's already proven that it has a chance at being successful. And once a trend emerges, that is, you release Incredible Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, whatever the other first movies were, suddenly you notice that all of these are profitable. Not only that, but incredibly profitable. By the time you reach something like Endgame and you're making well over $1 billion on a film, you have successfully followed the trend. And you notice how the incentive of money has created that trend, in essence. But that's not the only thing it creates. See, it also inspires this kind of separation. Because where there are these trends, there emerge a handful of different ideas. First of all is a kind of identification that creates in and out groups. That is, you're someone who likes Marvel, you're someone who doesn't. Suddenly, your consumption of a product becomes an identifier for the person that you are. No longer does your personality matter, but rather your identification with trends, and in that way, identification with brands and corporations. Are you a Kellogg's cereal fan, or whatever the other cereal is? Do you buy Nike shoes, or do you buy... Sorry, I really have no idea about any of this. Skechers? Maybe? And also, there's this idea of deterritorialization, which is a Deleuzian idea from Felix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze, which is the idea of, well, there's deterritorialization and reterritorialization, which is the idea that these originally emergent ideas that push back against the status quo become re-co-opted into the status quo and commodified for the protection of the status quo, but also as a means to sell a product through identification. Because you don't only identify with brands and trends, of course not. You identify with ideas, with ideology, with people. And if those people can be commodified, those ideas commodified, then they can be sold, which is then the emergence of another trend, as you'll notice. For instance, Black Lives Matter is a movement that has largely been commodified. It has been re-territorialized by the status quo and turned into a product rather than an actual movement for ideas. The ideas of it have largely been zapped, and we see that when mayors who claim to support Black Lives Matter then go and add a whole lot to police funding, something entirely antithetical to the entire movement. In fact, largely a big basis for the ideological standpoint of the movement. And then they can go and sell stickers. Or more importantly, in this case, what they're selling is a political idea that you then buy in the form of a candidate that then supports the status quo. In essence, everything that you like can be commodified. Everything you like can be turned into a product and sold back to you. So for instance, you're a film lover. That's great. I mean, films are already commodified even when they're actual pieces of art and not just content sold to you. But now imagine how we can better brand or better trend these pieces of art so that they can be sold as full-on products. This is where companies like Criterion and Arrow Video come in. Now, I myself love films, and I myself have largely fallen prey to this commodification of films. I have a huge collection of different Criterion films. I'll be the first to tell you that. I like the nice little cases they come in. But see, what this does is it inspires a culture of accumulation. And it inspires a culture of hoarding and excessive consumption. It's a way of thinking that makes you buy more, makes you consume more, and then all of a sudden your house is filled with these little plastic casings to something that is, in essence, superfluous, or as people often say to me, is superfluous. Why do you have that when you can just go online and watch the film? This brings us back to WNUF. Because there is no physical media representation of the film, or rather there is, but it's either on a debunked format or very hard to find, there is no preservation of the film in the physical medium. And like I said, this happens to films all the time, especially independent films that don't have high levels of distribution and aren't going to be profitable. So they're going to be shelved like the Magnificent Ambersons, or completely destroyed or lost. So this brings us to the job of preservation. How do we then preserve these films in a physical sense without inspiring this consumerism and this hoarding and accumulation of everything? We don't really want to encourage this harmful behavior. We don't really want people filling their homes with these small plastic casings just because they're afraid that the WNUF Halloween Special isn't going to be available online. Well, there is actually a pretty simple answer to this, and it's libraries. When I was growing up, I loved the library. I would go check out films from there all the time. They used to have VHSs that you would check out, but I mean, now they have loads of DVDs, or at least my local library does. So that brings the question back, well, Dylan, why are you complaining then? Why don't you go to the library and check out the WNUF Halloween Special? First of all, the WNUF Halloween Special is a pretty obscure film, and it's not featured in every library. Also, I am currently in a place where I don't have a library card, and honestly have no idea where the library is. The point being that not every film is going to end up in a library, and in truth, not every film should end up in a library, but we need some way to encourage this kind of preservation in a world that is controlled by corporate distribution. It's kind of like how public bathrooms actually discourage public urination and defecation, whereas when you have public bathrooms that you have to pay for, say, I don't know, here or a lot of Europe, that actually encourages public defecation and urination because there's nowhere to do it. So of course you're going to see a higher correlation between that. It's essentially the same idea with this physical consumption, though I don't have the exact answer of how to answer it. We just need libraries that have it. And if that means an online library, like the Internet Archive, that could very well be the answer. In fact, WNUF was on the Internet Archive for a while. It no longer is up anymore because of rights issues. So this brings us back to the branding of, for instance, films, Arrow and Criterion being the two greatest examples. But this isn't just wholly set on film, and this brings me kind of to my second part of the rant here, which is about literature and how branding has largely destroyed modern literature. Hear me out. You can look at, say, the Barnes & Noble Classic Editions, which I have 6 books in my room right now, and that is not one of them. Or you can look at, for instance, Loeb Classic Editions, which have this branded style to them as well. Now, the difference is Loeb Classics are very high quality books that have, of course, two-faced translations of classics. But the point remains that you could buy any two-face translation of classics. Why should you buy the specific Loeb edition? Well, because it's a brand and because it's a trend that you can recognize and it's been commodified. The point I want to make here is kind of the reduction of art into brands. I buy Criterion films. I like A24 films. I read Loeb Classics. I read Penguin Classics. I read Oxford Classics. Whatever, it doesn't matter. The point being that you're only looking at the brand or the emergent trend instead of at the art itself. And so there is a reduction of the human work put into creating that piece. New trends in literature have largely eroded what the landscape can be because they've become these derivations of content where the actual soul and humanity of the piece is stripped away in favor of what is essentially a mix between advertising and this perception of an avatar. That is, you're projecting a version of a person or book which seemingly aligns with your values or aesthetics, and we see brands do this all the time. For instance, as of the time of recording this, and I'm sure the time of upload, it's June, which is Pride Month. If you look around, you might notice a bunch of multi-billion-dollar corporations which in truth give no shit about people in the LGBT community, rebranding all their merchandise and all their marketing because they see a way to make more money by selling an ideal that a lot of people agree with, support, or find themselves actually in, back to them. They're essentially taking this identity of the LGBT community, or the identity of people who ally with the LGBT community, which is a huge swath of people, and they're selling that idea back to you. There's actually a name for this. It's called rainbow capitalism. I'm sure most of you know that already. The point is, the same thing happens in the world of art. Art, and at this point I'm going to specifically pivot to talk about literature, which is the second part of my rant here. I hope you're ready. Has become a lot more of a product. It has become a commodity and advertisement instead of the actual art that it originally entailed. This has become a super huge problem as of late, I'd say the past 5 years or so in the book industry, with things like BookTok promoting the same kind of idea, and rather books as aesthetic or books as products rather than books as art. And this brings us back to the idea of trends. You will notice now books are largely long-scale advertisements that adhere to trends, and as of such are also well-researched pieces that fit into an ever-emergent market. This is why you see the inclusion of things like smut into books. It's something that companies, that is publishing industry companies, know will sell. So they select books which include things like this that they then can commodify and fit into a trend, into an aesthetic that has built up a community. This is mainly true in fantasy romance, even normal scale sci-fi fantasy, where there is now an idea of what this book should be. Genre, instead of being a set of conventions used to identify the thematics of a story, like in the case of horror as we started with WNUF, has instead become a way to sell a book, which in part it always has been, but never to this extent. See, now we know when we picture romance what a romance book was. Think back to the 1800s, for example. You get tons of romances that don't really conform to this. Jane Austen is probably the best example, where her romances, yes, follow a very specific formula, her own formula, but in a lot of ways break that. Look at the Bronte sisters. Something like Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre is entirely against the formula even established in the 19th century, let alone the one today. Now if we look at romance books today, I say that and you picture a brand, essentially. This colorful cover with cartoon art and some cutesy title like... trying to think of romance titles here. You know what I mean. I'll put a couple of examples up here. And it's the same with these BookTok books, where suddenly a niche in the market, something people want to consume, has become the product itself. And that's why we see all these books that copycat each other to such an extreme degree. You see your Colleen Hoovers and your... Sorry, I have very little knowledge of the actual authors of this trend. The point being that this emergence of content has been a really easy way to commodify and sell back the genre of romance. And this has happened to all of literature. As I said, fantasy romance, fantasy, sci-fi, and even to an extent starting to go into horror. Although horror has always been a very interesting genre that is kind of resilient to these ideas. But you'll also see that they start to do that with identity as well. You start to understand the book as marketing terms. Enemies to lovers. Again, you're going to have to test me with these romance tropes. You know what I mean. These small tropes that are essentially marketing terms have become the entire book. Instead of using these cliches to either propel a story in a traditional sense, scaling it as a narrative that reflects narratives of the time, or to use it as a subversive element that goes against narratives of the time and creates more of a deconstructionist piece, you are instead using a small marketing term. That's what these tropes are. That's why you see them on the covers of books. They're not well-developed ideas or narratives. They are marketing terms. They're terms used to sell a product, turned into an entire story. In essence, art, as we've seen in the example of film and literature, though this is true for all of art at this point, has been turned into a shopping mall, where true artistic creative expression has been marginalized, and in favor of that, we've put up these window displays of product terms and tropes that people will recognize, and because they recognize it, will buy. We've seen these emergence of these trends that have reshaped the writing of creativity, where now your book will no longer sell unless it has smut in it, unless it has some element that can be marketable within it. And because of that, we have seen what I am perhaps hyperbolically going to call a loss of humanity. People no longer understand art, can no longer engage with it. We've lost our sense of media literacy because we have been drowned in the sea of contentiality. It's, in essence, the success of capitalist realism. It's the success of Fukuyama's End of History, and it's exactly what Mark Fisher told us about 12 years ago. This is not a new thing. This has been happening for at least the past 30 years, if not the past 100 years, if not the past 200 years. Slowly, because it's profitable, and because that's what our system incentivizes, art has taken a shift into the world of content. It has taken a shift into the world of identification and the world of products and ideas and avatars of different small groups that it can sell itself to and tropes that it can brand itself on. It's become a conveyor belt of production where the more similar you are to something else, the better chance you have of being sold, of being distributed. It's amazing how over 100 years ago-ish, Guy Debord told us all about this. This is essentially the society of the spectacle. Our focus has been shifted away from material concern into the world of aesthetic concern. The reason that we see all these emergent aesthetic trends, the superhero trend, the fantasy romance literature trend, all of this trends of art moving towards content, is not because of some societal cultural problem that we can point to. It's not because we're becoming more progressive or, Gen Z is more into sex, although apparently we're not. There's a weird debate there as well. It's because of our material concerns. It's because the people who control these industries, that is, these mega corporations, publishing houses, production houses, distribution houses, want to make money. And the best way to make money is to sell a product. It's not to sell a work of art. It's not to sell a piece that encapsulates the power of human creation. So how the heck does this tie back to WNUF? I know I've really spiraled out of control here. The point I'm trying to get at is that WNUF is an example of these pieces that are outside of the system. WNUF, in starting the analog horror trend, did something new. It certainly did something new for cinema, but largely did something new for horror and did something new for storytelling in general. And what does it get for that? Well, it inspired a whole generation of horror, a generation that's still going to this day. But it itself has been lost and forgotten, unpreserved, because it doesn't turn a profit. And no one wants to sell something that won't turn a profit. But we see how important something like that is because we see the ripple effects of WNUF. we see how something made with genuine innovation, genuine creativity, without trying to sell you something, without trying to fit into a global trend or a global identity or some other marketing group, makes a huge difference. This is a genuine piece of art, not because it's maybe the most well-produced movie, not because it has the best effects, not because it tells the best story, but because it isn't a product. And that's essentially the point I want to make with this whole long rant. We should be making art, the thing we have been making since the dawn of humanity. We have cave paintings that date back centuries, that date back millennia, back to the start of the human race. Since we have been on this planet, since we have existed, the thing that has separated us from every other part of nature, the reason that we use the term nature and can delineate where we start and nature starts, is art, is our ability to create something that on the surface serves no purpose. So why have we stopped doing that? Well, I've given you a couple of examples, and I'm sure you have plenty of your own as well. I'm not going to waste any more of your time trying to point out all the reasons that art has been destroyed or eroded over the years, has been commodified or turned into products or identities or all these other small pieces that have slowly stripped away its identity. Instead, I want to give you a call to action. We, human beings, are not businessmen. Business is not something inherent to humanity. Business, as we understand it, has existed for 200, 300, at most 400 years. That's hardly a drop in the history of humanity. If you want to look at the start of civilization, you look at pre-dynastic Egypt, which happened 5 millennia ago. 5 millennia, 5,000 years, and you're telling me the last 200 years is what defines the human spirit. That human nature is about greed, is about products, is about business and exchange and goods. I don't believe that. And I don't think you believe that either. Because there's plenty of people, not just through history, but even now, who don't live like businessmen, who don't act like consumers. So certainly there has to be something more to the human spirit than just mindless consumption. Well, the truth is, there is. And it's our ability to create. It's art. Art is the expression of the innately human. That is when it's art. When it's something not trying to prove a point, not trying to sell a product, not trying to please someone else, but when it is just a raw expression of humanity. So here's my call to action. You, me, everyone have the chance to change the future, have the chance to change the world. And instead of spending today giving you some big systemic call to action that you may or may not be able to accomplish, and you're certainly not able to accomplish on your own, let me give you something that you can do on your own. Make art, not content. Truly express yourself and your humanity and your ideas instead of trying to fit in to a pre-existing trend or product. Maybe If enough of us do that, we can start a new trend. It's happened before. Look at the new Hollywood of the 70s. Somehow, making true, expression-filled art did become profitable, did become a trend. And before we go and change the whole system, which is very necessary to correct this problem at its core, let's just start with this. Because if you're an artist, and I think a lot of people like to say they are, you should be making art. Thank you for watching my weird rant video. Like I said, I'm working on a handful of other videos, about 6 other ones, but I'm probably not going to be able to get any out until at least August. That includes the next career-ruining masterpieces, which is going to be about Orson Welles. I hope to at least get started on it this month, but the truth is, I'm not going to really be able to do any shooting or editing for the next 2 months. So, look forward to that. I like to have at least one video out next month so I can keep up this video a month schedule, but we'll see how that turns out. I'm also sorry for the unstructured nature of this video. I know it was all over the place, but I sincerely hope you learned something, and I'm glad that you stuck around till this part. Well, have a great day.